looking at the chapter on joints. And really the point of the chapter is not just about joints, but also about how we describe movement. The way I want to go through this is actually a little bit different from the way the book does, just in the sense of how it goes through in order. Actually, let me go to the chapter sections here. So not that you can read any of this, but it starts off with how we classify joints, and I'm going to talk about that. It has separate sections on the different types of classification, and I'm actually only going to talk about the third one, which is really the most important of them as far as what we cover in this class. Then I'm going to jump down. It has a section on the anatomy of selective joints, which is what the models there are for. And then I'm going to go back to the section in between the classification and the selected joints, which is on terms that describe movement. Now, this chapter I really kind of see as a transitional chapter. It happens to be sort of in the middle of the semester. But more importantly, the joints are how the bones are connected together in the skeleton. And when we move our body because of how those bones interact at joints. And obviously, we'll be talking about how we describe movement here. And that's going to lead into when we do muscles starting when we come back in a few weeks. Thinking about how that movement is produced to begin with. So again, it's kind of a transitional chapter. To some degree, it's kind of like the skin chapter. It's not vitally important as far as understanding what we're covering in this class. Not to say that the skin's not an important organ, but as far as how I present this class, I don't really get into the skin material too much. I will spend a bit of time here because it does set up a lot of the stuff that we need to understand for how the muscles work. More time on this than I would on the skin. But again, it's really just sort of a transitional aspect. And as I was talking about the second practical that you have coming up, the focus of that practical is really on the muscles and the nervous system. So even in terms of the lab material, while we're looking at models of the joints, it's more of setup for what we're going to be doing in the next section of the class. So looking at the classification of joints part here, there's two ways to classify joints, and that's summarized here. So you can classify joints structurally or functionally. And I'm going to talk about both aspects of that. But really, the functional classification system isn't going to be the one that we tend to keep with, or the one that we use. So again, there's structural, and there are three types of that. And there's functional, and there's three classifications for that. Now, actually, like I just said, the functional classifications, we don't really use too much. So I want to start there. I just want to list those terms kind of to get them out of the way, and it'll also lead into the fact that we're going to concentrate on the structural classification and a very particular version of that. Now, all of the functional classifications have similarities in their word structure. One is synarthrosis, or I should say, synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis, and diarthrosis. Now, these terms are nouns. An amphiarthrosis, a synarthrosis is a synarthrotic joint. The plural of these, the IS ending becomes an ES ending. I'm just stating that because these come from Greek and the parts of speech isn't quite so obvious. I will often refer to the joints using the adjective form, which, for instance, would be diarthrotic joint or amphiarthrotic joint or synarthrotic joint. Now, I changed that here because I want to talk about the parts of speech aspect to this, but in the book, they usually use the noun version of these words, synarthrosis, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, all of these have in common the root, oops, I misspelled that one, arthro, which actually is the Greek root that means joint. Okay. A common word that you've probably all heard before that has that same root is arthritis, okay, which means inflammation of joints. So when somebody has arthritis, there's fluid accumulating in the joints, which makes them harder to move and painful. Okay, but that's the same root there. So really the difference between these comes from what the prefix of each word is. Okay. So there's, whoops, syn, arthi, and di. Synarthrotic joints are joints that are together, which is basically what syn means here. And by that, I mean the bones are connected together and they don't move relative to each other. A good example of that, the common example in the book has a picture that depicts this, is the sutures in the skull, where two bones of the skull come together. The connective tissue on the outside of the bone, called the periosteum, which is mostly just collagen fibers, kind of melds together. So one bone kind of transfers, blends into the next bone as far as the soft tissue surrounding the bone. The collagen fibers in that periosteum basically weave the two bones together like a suture, like you're stitching something together. And that's why those joints in the skull are called sutures. The bones act as a single bone together. And that's where synarthrotic comes from. Amphiarthrotic joints are slightly movable. Okay. That's where amphi comes from. You're probably familiar with the word amphitheater, which is another example of that prefix. An amphitheater is a theater that's partially covered. Probably the most famous amphitheater, especially for Americans, is the Hollywood Bowl, mostly because it's in Hollywood, so it's a set used in a lot of movies. So you've probably seen this, this big half spherical covered stage, and where everybody sits is uncovered, okay? Trying to think, there's a recent movie that had, that's right. I guess I should be a little embarrassed that I'm really seeing this, but Yes Man with Zoe Deschanel and rubber face guy, Jim Carrey. There's this whole scene where they're at the Hollywood Bowl and the security guard finds them and they're racing around trying to get away. And the whole premise is Jim Carrey will always say yes to whatever anybody says. So the security guard says stop, so he stops. And then the girl says run, and he runs. And the security guard says stop, and he stops. And it's, you know, regular hilarity from Jim Carrey. But that's an amphitheater, a partially covered theater. And amphiarthrotic joints are partially movable joints. And to really stress what I mean by that, I want to say slightly more than partially. And then di, or really, I guess the prefix is really dia, means basically through from the Greek. And these are freely movable joints, meaning that they can move sort of in their full range, depending on the particular joint, how it works exactly. But when we think of joints, we usually think of the diarthrotic joints. We usually think of the ones that do move. But really, they're just one example, one functional group there. So having laid that out, I want to go back and talk about the structural joints, which is really sort of getting at the tissues that are involved with how the joints are connected. The first group are called fibrous joints. And so that means that they're connected by fibrous tissue, which really means dense, regular or irregular connective tissue, usually regular. The sutures in the skull that I was mentioning a second ago, those are fibrous joints because the fibrous periosteum of the bones is what holds them together. There are a number of fibrous joints which have ligaments, which is dense regular connective tissue connecting one bone directly to another bone. Those are also fibrous. The next structural type is called a cartilaginous joint. Which means that it's where cartilage comes, it is between the two bones. Now, actually, cartilaginous means that only cartilage is between the bones, aside from the fibrous tissue that's covering any bone anyways. We're going to see cartilage in these types of joints and in the third type that I'm going to mention in a second, but the third type doesn't have the word cartilage in its name. It's just in that third type, there's a lot more than just cartilage in those joints. So cartilaginous joints are the ones that are pretty much just cartilage. When I was talking about fibrocartilage back when we were doing tissues, I mentioned the intervertebral discs and the pubic symphysis. Those are examples of cartilaginous joints because there's fibrocartilage between the two joints, between the two bones, whether it's between the bodies of two vertebral bones or between the two pelvic bones where they come together at the pubic arch. That's just cartilage there. The third type is called a synovial joint, and that's the type that we're going to be paying the most attention to. Now, what makes it a synovial joint is that it is an enclosed cavity surrounding where the two joints come together that includes a fluid called synovial fluid, which is secreted by connective tissue called a synovial membrane. And I'll show you what all that looks like in a little bit. But before I go on to that, I just want to sort of finish up talking about what's going on here. Now, oftentimes when we have these two lists of three different things, we'll want to relate item 1 in one list with item 1 in the other list, and item 2 in one list, 2 in the other list. That's mostly okay with this set of joints, but there are some exceptions. Synarthrotic joints are usually like 99% or so fibrous joints also, but there are some examples of fibrous joints that do move a little bit. So there are some exceptions to synarthrotic joints being fibrous. And then cartilaginous joints are usually amphiarthrotic, but there are some exceptions. And it really kind of depends on how you define that. Probably the best example of an amphiarthrotic joint is the pubic symphysis, where the two pelvic bones come together at the pubic arch. It only moves during childbirth. Okay. Otherwise, it needs to be very static because it's very important for supporting body weight across the pelvic girdle. So kind of depending on how you define that, if you just talk about humans in general, then yes, it does move slightly across all of the instances of that kind of joint. But really, in half of the human population, it doesn't move. Okay. And in the half where we could say that it moves, it doesn't necessarily move for everybody. Now, as I was trying to explain this one year, I got myself into apparently a little trouble that I didn't mean to. So I want to set this up so that people don't misinterpret what I'm about to say, like happened one semester. Or actually, I guess I have to say it before I can explain what I mean by it. But I had said to the class at one point that childbirth does not represent a significant portion of a woman's life. And a woman over in the corner of the room started to really bawl me out for that. And she misinterpreted what I meant by significant. Yes, it can be very emotionally significant to a woman's life. What I meant was, as far as the time that a woman spends alive in her life, a very insignificant time is spent in childbirth. And I'm sure most women are thankful for that. Even if your last name is Duggar, you're not going to be spending a whole lot of time in childbirth. Okay. So I don't actually know all the numbers, but I kind of get the concept of Mrs. Duggar. This is the woman who's the mother of the family that's in 19 and counting, or whatever they call the show, which is a family that believes that procreation is mandated through their interpretation of religion. So she has 19 kids. And if I remember correctly, there's only one pair of twins, or maybe two pairs of twins. So she's had 19 kids, and I believe at the time when she had 19 kids, and she might have more by now for all I know, she was 43 years old, okay? So if you were to look at somebody's life, and I'm not going to do the math to actually figure this out, but from when she's born to when she's 43 years old, there's a certain amount of hours that we could say that lasts. I'm not going to do the math for how many hours there are in a year and times, et cetera, but it's a lot of freaking hours. I'm sure you can agree with me on that. So she has 19 kids. One or two of those might have been sets of twins. One or two of those pregnancies might have been sets of twins. So we're talking 16 or 17 episodes of labor, okay? And on average, I have no idea because I've never looked into her family history that much, and I don't really care to, but let's just say on average she spends 5 hours in labor with each pregnancy. I have no idea how realistic that is, but I would imagine after about 16 or 17 births, labor is going to be really short there at the end. But so let's just say 5 hours. I could be off by orders of magnitude. I doubt it's 50 hours in labor, but even so, compared to all of the hours that she's been alive in her 43 years of life, 16 times 5, let's say 10, because the math is easier there, 160 hours in labor compared to all of the hours that she's been alive in her entire life is insignificant as far as time's concerned. So it's a slightly movable joint, okay? And then even if we're going to say half the population could potentially move that joint, there's certainly a lot of people in that population that haven't had children, maybe because they're too young, because there are other reasons they didn't have them, they didn't want to, whatever it might be. So slightly movable joint is really very, very much slightly movable, okay? That's what we mean by a cartilaginous joint. Now, there are cartilaginous joints that are actually synarthrotic. They don't move. And probably the best example of that is the joint between the first pair of ribs and the sternum. When you breathe, your rib cage expands, and the first pair of ribs are connected to the manubrium of the sternum, kind of like the knot in this tie. And I'm not going to switch over to the picture just to do this, because I'd have to be in the picture. But when you breathe, the first pair of ribs and the sternum move as one piece. So that joint doesn't actually move, but there is cartilage there. So it's a cartilaginous joint. It's just this is synarthrotic joint. So with the fibrous to synarthrotic or cartilaginous to amphiarthrotic, usually that's true, but there are some exceptions to that. However, synovial joints are always diarthrotic, and diarthrotic joints are always synovial. That relationship is definitive. And really, that's what we care most about. That's what we're going to spend most time on, is looking at diarthrotic or synovial joints. The exceptions to the other two aren't really anything to get too concerned about. I'm going to focus on the synovial joints, and so you'll know that all of those joints definitely fall into the exact same functional category, which is diarthrotic. So, synovial joints. This is the common picture to depict what a synovial joint is. What this is supposed to represent is a joint between two phalanges, which means one of your knuckle joints. And the picture is actually exaggerating things a little bit to point out where everything is, but and I'll explain the implications of that in a second. But that's what we're talking about here. So the joint, or I should say the synovial membrane that makes up the joint, is really kind of the continuous layer of connective tissue that lines the inside of this space. They're pointing specifically at this here, which I guess is colored kind of orange, and naming that the synovial membrane. And there's a reason for that, which I'll explain in a second. But the joint, we can start anywhere around here. It's really kind of a complete enclosed space. Let's say we start here with the joint capsule or articular capsule, which is made up of probably dense irregular connective tissue that connects one bone to the other bone. And that blends into the periosteum of the bone. Okay, dense irregular connective tissue in the joint capsule, dense irregular connective tissue of the periosteum of the bone. They blend into each other. And then that blends into the articular cartilage, which is a thin layer of hyaline cartilage tissue that's still there even after the bone went through its endochondral growth. That acts as a little cushion or pad at the end of the bone. And then that blends into the periosteum, which blends into the joint capsule, which goes back to the other bone, blends into the periosteum, blends into the articular cartilage. And it just makes this continuous enclosure for the whole thing. Now, the orangey kind of area here that's pointed out as the synovial membrane is more precisely where the synovial fluid is being made. There will probably be some sources that you might come across that will describe this synovial membrane region here as an epithelium that secretes a fluid, but it's not. This is, if you go back to the tissue chapters, the one membrane that is not an epithelial membrane. And the cells that secrete that fluid are some specialized cells that are part of the areolar connective tissue that really lines that inside of the joint cavity. And they're secreting the synovial fluid that they make basically from the blood passing through that tissue. And the synovial fluid is secreted into the space between the two bones that's encapsulated within the joint capsule that we see here. That fluid acts as a lubricant so that when you're moving those joints, they move easily across each other. Now, like I said at the beginning, this picture, which is the common example of this in pretty much every A&P book, is exaggerating the joint capsule a little bit. There really wouldn't be this much space within there filled with that much fluid. More likely, the joint capsule will kind of collapse in on either side, and the articular cartilage from either bone will basically be touching in the middle. One difference, however, from how this is drawn, is that that synovial fluid will have soaked into most of this tissue. So the articular cartilage, which is a hyaline cartilage, will have a lot more fluid in its ground substance, in the matrix space, making it more of a cushion. If you were to have this much fluid in one of your knuckle joints, you'd have a very obvious enlarged joint, which is what you see actually in arthritis. So if this were supposed to be any kind of accurate picture, this would be a good picture of an arthritic joint. Arthritis, again, is the swelling of a joint, and that swelling is going to be accumulation of fluid within the synovial cavity. It might not be exactly synovial fluid. It might be more just a watered down synovial fluid, but whatever, it's accumulated fluid. Okay. And as that kind of fills this space, it can press out against and exert pressure on the joint capsule and make it harder for that joint to move. And it can be more painful. As well as in arthritis, along with the fluid that's secreted, there are going to be chemical signals that stimulate pain receptors. So really, again, this is exaggerated to highlight what the synovial space looks like, but if that much fluid were actually found between two bones, you'd really be talking about arthritis at that joint. Okay. But that's your basic setup for a synovial joint. Now, there are 6 different types of synovial joints, which are laid out in this figure here. Okay. I want to go through this figure, and then I'm actually going to write them out as a list on the text page so that people can see that as a text slide. Oh, and before there, actually, I want to go here and say a few things. First off, the joints are defined as how they move are classified by that. We have, whoops, not an okay joint, a planar joint, which means that it moves along a two-dimensional plane. And then we have uniaxial, biaxial, and multi-axial joints, which can be called triaxial, but more often they're called multi-axial. And for these 3 collectively, that's just how many different axes of movement there are around each joint. Okay. Now, I have seen in recent years a few sources that will use a different word than uniaxial. You might see monoaxial, which is an abomination unto the Lord. Okay? And what I mean by that actually is when you're making up words for science, you're using Greek or Latin roots. Uni and axial are both from Greek. Mono is Latin. So monoaxial is an abomination because it's combining Latin and Greek roots. And that's just not really the way that you're supposed to do that. So if you ever see monoaxial, burn the book because it's an abomination to the Lord. And remember that it's actually uniaxial, which means, again, one axis of movement. And then the other ones would be 2 axes of movement, and then 3 axes of movement. Now, multi-axial really sounds like it means that there are multiple axes of movement, but really there's not more than 3. Okay, and that's why triaxial is a perfectly acceptable version of that. I've only seen triaxial used or referred to in recent sources. Multi-axial is a more common expression there. And it kind of makes me think that anatomists can't count to 3. It's like they say 1, 2, lots, and they just can't get to 3. And that would be a lot more funny if you knew that there's another place in anatomy that that same sort of thing happens. And I'll point it out when we get to it so you can have a good laugh with me. But yes, it really is 1, 2, and 3 axes of movement. So those 4 different definitions apply to the different joints we have here. I'm going to go through and explain them in order of the 4 things I just said. Okay, so I'm actually going to start down here with D as far as this is concerned. That's a plane joint, which obviously is a planar type joint. What it means is 2 two-dimensional surfaces will move across each other in any direction within that two-dimensional plane. Okay. This book, maybe, and definitely other sources, will try to say that that counts as a uniaxial joint. It's not. There's no axis. An axis is a line. A plane is a plane, and never the twain shall meet. So this is when two flat surfaces move across each other. The example that they're using here, pointing out, is where two short bones in the ankle come together. So the intertarsal joints are plane joints. Another often presented example is the intercarpal joints in the wrist. Now, for this picture, they happen to have something else in the hand area represented here, and then this hand over here. So there's not enough hands to go around to show all three of those types of joints. And so the plane joint is perfectly acceptable to point out down here in the ankle, because it's the same kind of joint. Now, the tarsals in the ankle and the carpals in the wrist are all collectively short bones when we're talking about bone types in a previous lecture. And what characterizes short bones is that they have flat faces where they come up against each other. So these joints, when they're moving, are in fact moving across each other in this fashion. If you took a book and put it on the table in front of you and moved it around on that table in any direction in that two-dimensional plane, that's what a plane joint does. Okay, so that's the one example of a planar joint, which is the plane joint. Some sources might refer to it as, I think, a gliding joint or something like that, just so that it sounds like it has a different word, but plane, planar, whatever, it's the same thing. Now, the next two I want to show you are both examples of uniaxial joints. And again, as I was saying, that a planar joint is not uniaxial because it doesn't have an axis. These are uniaxial because they have an axis. So if we were to look at one of these joints, I'm going to start with the elbow joint, and we drew a line through that joint, the way that that joint moves is only around that one line. Okay? I can't put a line through the joint in a different direction and move there. It only moves around a single axis, so it's uniaxial. There are two examples of this. The hinge joint, which is the one that's in the elbow, is usually the primary example of that. And it's called a hinge joint because it looks very much like a hinge like we'd have on a door here. Where the two bones come together, the humerus and the ulna wraps around sort of a central pin or cylinder of the humerus. And so the ulna basically, let me do it with my hands, is wrapped around like this, and so it's going to pivot on that axis of the joint. The other example that they have here that's a pivot joint, it's a really good example, and a lot of other books use a different example to point it out, but I think this is the most obvious example of a pivot joint. It's the joint between the first and second vertebral bones. Those two bones have special names. C1, the first cervical bone, is called Atlas. It's named Atlas because it holds up your head, just like Atlas from Greek mythology held up the world. And then C2 is called Axis because it's the axis around which Atlas will rotate. So if my hand here is C1, Atlas, it rotates around axis like this, making it possible for you to move your head back and forth, to rotate your head there. The other example, which I might show you on the models later on, that's often given is where the radius and ulna come together just distal to the elbow joint. The problem with that, it's really hard to demonstrate that movement because it's about moving your hand back and forth, which we'll talk about later on with movement terms. But you don't really see that movement happening within, the forearm flipping back and forth. It's very easy to demonstrate on the model, and I will probably show it to you in a little while when I switch to the camera. But I think the where your head rotates to shake your head no like that is a really good example of that. Okay. So those are both uniaxial joints. Okay, they only move around a single axis, whether it's like a hinge at the elbow or pivoting like we see happening in the neck there. The next two are the biaxial joints, and they're actually very, very similar joints. The first one is the condyloid joint. The common example of that, which is what they're pointing at here, is, oh, actually they're technically pointing at something else, but I'm going to describe it slightly differently. The common example of this is the joint between a metacarpal bone and the first phalanx, the proximal phalanx of any finger. So when I was talking about the synovial joint with a picture earlier, and I said that's a knuckle joint, that means a joint between two phalanges, okay, those knuckles. Here I'm talking about a joint between the proximal phalanx, which is the one closest to your hand, and the metacarpal bone, which is the one that's in the palm of your hand. There are two axes of movement that we can make for this joint. One allows us to move the finger back and forth like this. Okay. The other one, if we draw a line 90 degrees off from that first axis, allows us to move our fingers back and forth like this. Now, the thing about a condyloid joint is while it has two axes of movement, one of them is much easier to move than the other. So you can move your fingers back and forth quite easily like this, but then going side to side, there's a lot less movement in that. It's a little tricky describing what's happening here movement-wise before I give you the terms to describe movement. So I'm going to use very vague words like back and forth and that sort of thing at this point. But I'll point out those movement terms later on. So condyloid joints necessarily have one direction of movement that's better than the other direction of movement. That's part of sort of their definition. The example actually from the book here, they're pointing out where the radius and the carpal bones of the wrist come together. Not the best example, again, because it's hard to demonstrate, but you can move your wrist back and forth like this pretty easily, and you can move it side to side. It doesn't move quite as much side to side. That would be a condyloid kind of joint. Okay. But I prefer the metacarpal phalangeal joint. It's a better example. Another example of a condyloid joint actually is back up in the neck. Okay, so earlier I was talking about where C1 and C2 meet, that's a pivot joint. C1 is called atlas, C2 is called axis. The joint between C1, which is atlas again, and the occipital bone is a condyloid joint. Okay. Now, this particular model is kind of falling apart, so it's not a great example of it, but I'm going to use it as much as I can. So this big piece here that has the number 500 written on it, that's the occipital bone. And then the vertebral bone right next to it is the atlas bone. Okay. Everybody's familiar with the idea of atlas, big strong guy that's holding the world up on his shoulders. If you've ever been to 30 Rockefeller Center, they have a statue of this out front. If you've not been to 30 Rockefeller Center, but you've seen the show 30 Rock, it's part of the opening credits there. No, you've seen it. It makes it possible for you to move the occipital bone back and forth like that. That's the direction that this condyloid joint is best at. And that is essentially nodding your head yes. Okay. It's also possible to move the occipital joint side to side a little bit. That's really hard to do just on your own. If I'm sitting here going, okay, I'm moving my head side to side like that, I'm actually not doing it at that particular condyloid joint entirely. I'm doing it across all of the cervical bones. If I can isolate the rest of my neck and just move my head side to side, That's just the movement there at the top. And it's a lot less than the movement like you're nodding your head back and forth. Okay. That's also a condyloid joint. The other biaxial joint is actually a variation on the condyloid joint. And it's the saddle joint. Now, part of the reason why I described the condyloid joint with the metacarpal phalangeal joint is because the saddle joint is in a kind of similar location. It's actually not a metacarpal phalangeal joint. It's instead the metacarpal carpal joint of your first digit in your hand, okay, which means it's at the base of your thumb. So instead of where the phalanx meets the metacarpal, right here, that's a condyloid joint. Down here, where the metacarpal makes a joint on the other end to the carpal bone next to it, that's a saddle joint. And the thing about the saddle joint is that it has as much movement in one direction as it has in the other. Okay? So it's just a little bit more movable biaxial joint than the condyloid joint. And it's very important pointing it out there because it's what makes it possible for us to move our thumb across the palm of our hand so that we can touch our other fingers. Okay? The only place where we see a saddle joint is at that joint, so that our thumb can actually move like that slightly differently from all the other fingers. Okay. I've had students in the past ask me some questions about this, and I can't really restate all the questions exactly, but it's led me to try to look a little bit deeper into this, which I haven't really satisfactorily done. But I think a student asked something like, are humans the only ones that have saddle joints or something like that? I'm not entirely positive about that, but if you look at other primate species, they also have the ability to move their thumb across to meet their fingers and hold on to things. For that matter, raccoons do also. But trying to get a good, did somebody just beep or was that me? Oh, okay, because that's the same beep that this makes when it stops recording. So, okay, good, there's your phone. We'll get back to the recording. I wish I could edit that out, but I can't. Anyways, these other primates have the ability to grasp things like we do. I just haven't been able to find a very reliable or definitive source that says they have a saddle joint too. I did find something describing the anatomy of the hand of a chimpanzee, and what's kind of strange about them is that their thumb is actually, or I should say the metacarpal region is actually much longer, so their thumb is in a very different place, and it has to do with kind of how they move their wrist that gives their thumb the ability to move. Whether they have a saddle joint there or not, I don't know. Doesn't really matter. Partly the reason I always was interested in that is the saddle joint came up in an episode of CSI a long time ago. So I don't know if anybody watches CSI, and of course nowadays there's lots of variations of CSI, including the new exciting CSI Cyber, starring an Academy Award winner, whatever her name is, I forgot now, but sorry. No, you know, the original CSI was set in Los Angeles. And so I think it's early in the third season, but I'm not positive. One of the shows opened with them blowing up a casino, as happens a lot in Las Vegas, because more money comes in. They want to build a new casino, and it's already crowded enough there, so they just blow up old casinos and build new ones on top. So it starts off with that. And then suddenly they have to stop because they discover some bones at the bottom of what was an elevator shaft in the building. So they call in the CSI team, and they come in and look at all that stuff. And they deem it as a potential crime scene. So they have to investigate. It shuts down the construction on the new casino and all this stuff. So the foreman for the demolition crew or the construction crew, I don't remember which, comes up to one of the CSIs and says, do we really have to sit here and not, continue our job just because you found some bones down there? How do we even know that those are human bones? And so the CSI, which happened to be CSI Seidel, if you watch the show, standing a good 20 yards from the bone, said, there's a saddle joint right there. And so what she was saying is that because it's a saddle joint, that's a human opposable thumb. And partly from that and from some questions from students, I was really trying to find out if other species had saddle joints. There are other species that can grasp things with their hands, but they do it anatomically the same way we do. I don't really know. But it's always interesting to me as an anatomist to be watching shows like this and something like that comes up. They say, that's a saddle joint. There's no way from that distance that she could have looked at those bones and said, that's a saddle joint. But whatever. So those two are the biaxial joints. And then the multi-axial joint, which is really triaxial, is the ball and socket joint. It's the only one like that. Now, there's actually 4 ball and socket joints. The hips, of which there are 2, there's a left and right hip, and the shoulders, again, 2, left and right. Those are the only joints that are ball and socket joints. And they're the ones that are capable of moving in 3 different directions. Okay, so if we draw an axis through the shoulder joint, it's kind of hard to do. Like this, okay, so this axis here, we can move our arm in this direction. If we draw a line this way, we can move our arm this way. And if you draw the axis this way, you can rotate your arm. Now, with a straight arm, that's kind of hard to see, but if I bend my elbow, I'm rotating my arm at the shoulder here, and rotating it medially and rotating it laterally there. The same sort of thing can be done at the hip. Okay, so you can do the Rockettes kick like this, or you can do this, or you can rotate like that. Okay, so those are all movements of a multi-axial or triaxial joint. Again, multi-axial is the more common way to refer to it. So I said I was going to write all that down here, and let me just put them under the different groups. The plane joint, which was the intertarsal joint. The uniaxial joints, which were the hinge joint, like at the elbow, and the pivot joint, like at the axis atlas joint, which is not really the best way to name that, but that's what I'm going to stick with there. And then the biaxial joints, we had the condyloid joint, which I'm going to stick with my example rather than the one from the book, which was the metacarpal phalangeal joint. And there's the saddle joint, which was the metacarpal carpal joint of the first digit, meaning the thumb. There's not a saddle joint between the metacarpal and carpal bones of the first digit of the foot. Your big toe does not have a saddle joint, but just the thumb and the hand. And then finally, the multi-axial joint, which is ball and socket joint, like at the shoulder or hip. Right, so that's way too much to fit on the screen at once. Let me make that smaller. That'll do. Okay. So those are the different types of joints, categorized by how they move. Any questions about those types of joints? I just saw a typo. There's an N right there in phalangeal. That's fine, whatever. Okay. Okay, so I do want to go into talking about some of the specific joints. Before I switch over to the camera to look at the models, let me go back to the book here. And again, where is it? Anatomy of Selected Joints. The book actually runs through the anatomy of several selected joints. I'm only going to really talk about one of them in any detail. It starts by talking about, this is the axial Atlantic joint, or Atlantic axial joint, which, or actually I should say, yeah, the atlantoaxial joint. Atlanto means atlas, okay? What do you usually associate the word Atlantic with? The ocean, right? That's what where it comes from. But it actually comes from that Greek mythology. Okay? As far as the Greeks were concerned, the world was Greece and a little bit of stuff surrounding it they knew about. Okay? To the south, across the Mediterranean Sea, were some weird people that like to build pyramids. Okay? And to the west, along the Mediterranean Sea, were a bunch of people that like to make pizza, whatever. To the north were a bunch of uncivilized people that were always trying to raid them and steal things, but had to go over the mountains, and it was really hard for them to do that. And to the east were people that like to steal beautiful women. Anybody get that reference? Troy? I don't know. So that was their idea. That's just what was around them. And beyond what they knew of the world, they just assumed everything else was ocean. Okay. They imagined Greece was the pinnacle of civilization, and therefore it's right on top of the world. And then Mount Olympus is sort of the highest point in Greece, and that's where the gods live. And so that was right on top of everything else. So when Atlas is holding up the ocean, what's sitting on his shoulders is all of the part of the world that they don't know about, and they just assume is the ocean. So they call that the Atlantic Ocean, because it was what was sitting on Atlas's shoulders. Okay. So here, not that you can read it too well, but I've highlighted the word. It says atlantoaxial joint. That's the joint between the first and second vertebra, which are these two right here, and it makes it possible for you to shake your head no. There's actually a little bit of bone sticking up out of C2 axis, which is the physical axis of rotation. And in this picture, we're looking from a superior view down onto that. So this little piece right here is part of C2, the bone C2, which the bone C1 rotates around. And there's a little fibrous ligament there, which allows for that movement zone. So they mention that. And then they show the only movable joint in the skull, which is the temporomandibular joint. This is a rather complex joint. Okay? Your jaw can actually move in a bunch of different ways. So it's not just a simple hinge like your jaw opening and closing, but rather it allows for a number of different kinds of movements. And I'm actually going to talk about those movements in a little while. Then they talk about the shoulder joint, some structures in there, the elbow joint, the hip joint, and finally the knee joint. Now, I actually want to talk about the knee joint in a little bit more detail. I have that figure from the chapter here. So let me use these figures to talk about a little bit, and then I'll go to the model and point some stuff out. Now, there's a lot of stuff in all of these pictures, and I just want to point out a few things. And let me see. Yeah, I can zoom in. This is a sagittal section through the joint, so we're looking at it kind of from a lateral view, but only half of the joint. It points out some of the synovial cavity and some other structures in here. One thing about the knee, which is kind of unusual for a synovial joint, is it does not have a continuous synovial cavity. Okay? It's actually open a little bit, and the fluid within the synovial cavity of the knee can actually work its way up into other spaces around the knee. If you've ever heard of somebody having water on the knee, that's really because the synovial fluid from the knee joint is getting displaced or leaking into other areas around here, which is very unusual for a synovial joint. Now, the structures I want to point out, first of all, are these things called a meniscus. In this view, we really only see one. We see it in two places, but there's the lateral meniscus, which is pointed out here, and more of the lateral meniscus here. You can see off to the side, there's a label that says medial meniscus, which is actually in the other picture. So let me move over here. This picture is looking down on the knee joint with the femur removed, and we're looking at the head of the tibia where the condyles of or the epicondyles, whatever, of the femur fit into it. The meniscus is fibrocartilage that makes a pad up for the femur to sit on. There's a lateral meniscus, which is all that was visible in that sagittal section through the knee joint. But there's also a medial meniscus. It's two separate pieces of fibrocartilage, but together they make a continuous pad for the femur to sit on. Now, the fact that it's fibrocartilage is very important because what fibrocartilage is for is bearing body weight. So all of your body weight is bearing down on your knees, especially when you're standing. And so that fibrocartilage is there to absorb that the stress of your body weight bearing down your knees. There are a lot of people that have problems with their menisci, I guess is the plural of that. As weight bears down on that, or if somebody has a problem with their knee, the fibrocartilage can be damaged or torn, or it can wear away or something like that. So a lot of people that have knee pain, it's actually because this fibrocartilage is breaking down, and it's causing the femur to push directly into the tibia, which can be very painful. The other thing I want to point out, we can actually see in this picture here, and I'm going to go back to the previous picture to point it out there, are these ligaments, which are called cruciate ligaments. There's an anterior cruciate ligament and a posterior cruciate ligament. And if we look over here, they point out the anterior cruciate ligament crossing over there. And then the posterior cruciate ligament, that we can see a little bit of it. It's mostly obscured by the anterior ligament here. But now they're cruciate ligaments, cruce from, I guess that's Latin, means cross. And so they're named cruciate ligaments because they actually do cross over. The anterior cruciate ligament crosses over anterior to the posterior cruciate ligament. Now, this figure isn't a great place to see it, and they've cut the ligaments apart a little bit here, but this picture does show you pretty well. The anterior cruciate ligament connects the medial tibia to the lateral femur. And the posterior cruciate ligament kind of attaches the lateral tibia to the medial femur. Okay. Now, the point of these ligaments is really to make it possible for the two bones to stay upright. Okay. And so let me actually try switching to this picture here. This is going to be very interesting. Okay. So let me get really in here. Don't I have a lovely tie today? So first off, while I'm here, the menisci are here. Okay. This is the lateral meniscus. This is the medial meniscus. I have pulled the quadriceps tendon and the patellar ligament out of the way so we can see in here a little bit. And if we open up the joint like that, we can look down on the meniscus a little bit there. Okay. Now, we can see the anterior cruciate ligament going right across there. And if we look posteriorly, we can see some posterior cruciate ligament going there. There's more than what I'm just pointing at. I mean, there's more in what I'm pointing at than just the posterior cruciate ligament, but it would be right about in there. Okay. Again, the anterior cruciate ligament, which we see right here, is going from the medial tibia to the lateral femur, okay? And the posterior, which again is more posterior, is going from the lateral tibia to the medial femur, okay? Now, the cruciate ligaments are referred to often by their initials. There's the, that's kind of funny with the screen in the background. There's the anterior cruciate ligament, which is called the ACL, and the posterior cruciate ligament, which is called the PCL. Now, how many of you have heard of those ligaments before, especially by their abbreviations? Raise your hands. Okay, keep them up. How many of you are raising your hand because you've heard of the ACL but not the PCL? Okay, and then how many of you are raising your hand because you've heard of the PCL but not the ACL? Okay. What did you notice and who raised their hands for that last question? No one. Okay, people have heard of the ACL for the most part. Now, why have you heard of the ACL? It's a common sports injury, right? And PCL injuries are also sports injuries. They're just much less common. What usually happens in that injury to cause an ACL tear? Sure, you've heard of them, but you don't know what's actually happening? Yeah, so the ligament's going to be torn, but what caused the tear? Yeah, it's a sports injury, but what happened? That's what tear means, but what happened to cause the tear? Hmm? Not hyperextended usually. It's lateral trauma, okay? If somebody hits the knee joint from the side like that, then that's going to force the two bones to kind of bend to the side a little bit. Okay. Now, I don't know if you caught it when I was talking about the knee joint a little bit ago. I said when we're looking down on the medial and lateral meniscus, when the femur was not in the picture and we're just looking at the tibia, I said it's where the condyles or epicondyles or whatever they're called of the femur sit. So these two big bumps right here are the condyles of the femur, or epicondyles. I might have the wrong name. They're these big kind of bulbous things sticking out here. When the knee bends, they kind of act like the hinge part of the joint. Okay? But what kind of joint does that word really remind you of? Condyle. Condyloid joint, okay? Which is not a hinge joint. It's a biaxial joint. And in fact, the knee joint is not a hinge joint, okay? It's very similar to the elbow, which is a hinge joint, but it's not just a hinge joint. Primarily, it moves like a hinge, like this, but, can you see that? Sure. But it also can move a little bit side to side. I don't believe there's anybody alive that actually has any muscular control over that condyloid joint for that side to side movement. But the joint has that ability because if there's lateral trauma to the joint or medial trauma to the joint has to give a little bit, okay? Because that happens quite a bit. And not necessarily, something hitting the side of the joint, but just in walking, you're not always going to take a perfectly straight step, and you're always going to have the weight distributed perfectly in a linear fashion across the knee joint. So you need the knee joint to wobble a little bit side to side. We don't do that with any muscular control, but it has the ability to do that. Okay. However, if there is some really severe lateral trauma to the joint, then that's going to cause a cruciate ligament tear. A lateral blow to the knee is going to cause an ACL tear, and a medial blow to the knee is going to cause a PCL tear. Okay. When that happens, if there's a really hard blow to the side of the knee like that, then the knee is going to, I can't do it with this model without tearing the model apart, but the knee is going to bend like that. Okay. So the medial, wait, why does that not do what I want it to do? Suddenly I have a little misgivings about what I said earlier, but whatever it is, the knee is going to bend like that, okay? And that direction puts more stress on the ACL than if there's medial trauma and the knee's bending that direction. Okay. Now, there are other ligaments that can be involved in it than just that one, but that's why you've primarily heard of that one. So if you hear of ACL tears much more than you hear of PCL tears, that's because it's more likely for there to be lateral trauma to the knee than medial trauma to the knee. Why is it more likely to be that you're going to hit? Why is it more likely that trauma in this direction at the knee is going to occur rather than this direction? Why not? Why not? Because you have another leg, exactly. Okay. Your medial knee compartment is protected by your other leg. Okay. Sure, if you're doing the Heisman, somebody can clip you from the medial side and you'll have a PCL tear. That's even what the Heisman looks like. I guess not. But it's much more common for there to be lateral trauma to the knee. Okay. So that sort of demonstrates that a little bit. In the middle of it describing that, I suddenly had a feeling that I got medial and lateral mixed up somewhere in there. But lateral trauma in the knee is more likely to affect the ACL. Since I was talking about it earlier and I have these handy, I do want to point out with this model here, this is the elbow joint. So the elbow's a hinge. It moves like this, okay? But it's also a good joint model to show you a different joint, which is the radial ulnar joint right here, okay? And that's a pivot joint, which is the more common example of a pivot joint in most textbooks, but not a very good example to demonstrate on the body. So when your hands are turning over like that, okay, what's happening with the bones is that they're pivoting relative to each other like that. And so this joint right here, where the radius and the ulna come together proximally, there's a pivot joint there, okay, which is really well demonstrated in this model here. So just as I turn my arm over, the bones are doing that. Okay. So while I had the camera up, I wanted to show you that just as an example. And in talking about the movement terms, I actually want to demonstrate that movement a little bit more. So speaking of movement terms, let me go back to the screen capture. Get rid of this thing. Okay. Again, what I wanted to highlight with the knee, instead of everything that's listed here, I just wanted to point out the meniscus, medial and lateral meniscus, and the cruciate ligaments there. There are more things there, but those are the ones I wanted to point out in this, especially because of what it has to do with trauma to the knee, lateral trauma to the knee. In the book, after, I guess it's down a little bit, yeah. After talking about the knee, there's disorders to the joint section here, and they talk a little bit about lateral trauma to the knee and an ACL tear. They include another ligament in there, which I'm not mentioning by name because by not saying it, that lets you know that it's not something I'm going to hold you responsible for. But this is getting at the ACL tear thing there. Okay. So I'm actually backing up a little bit in the book to go into the movement terms section here, or types of body movement. I'm going to use the book a little bit to talk about this and not go back to the camera, partly because I am going to demonstrate these movements to you, but I don't want to capture that on camera for posterity's sake. So I'm just going to use the pictures up here as far as anybody that's watching this on YouTube is concerned. Okay. Now, when we're talking about movements, we usually are talking about, again, specialized words that mean specific things in the context of anatomy. So just like back at the beginning of the class, we were learning about the special words for directions within the body, like superior and inferior and all that sort of thing. We have terms like that for movement also. And for the most part, they're going to be presented pairwise. For example, I want to start with flexion and extension. These are usually movements that are in the anterior, posterior plane of the body, I guess you could say. So, whoops, I get rid of these pictures so I don't accidentally go to them. So here we have some examples of flexion and extension. Okay. Generally speaking, flexion is when we move something anteriorly, and extension is when we move something posteriorly. So if I'm going to flex my elbow, I'm moving it to make it bend. Okay? When I extend my elbow, it's going to come back. Now, really what I'm doing here is I'm standing in anatomical position. So from anatomical position, when my elbow flexes, I'm bringing my forearm in a anterior position. I can do the same thing at the elbow joint. I can flex, not the elbow joint, at the shoulder joint, I can flex my shoulders, then bringing my arms forward. Extending means to bring them back. Now, the book and some sources don't include hyperextension in this, but I think it's an important way to talk about this. I can flex my arm, bringing it anteriorly from the shoulder. I can extend it, bringing it back to anatomical position. Really, when I'm going past anatomical position in the posterior direction, that should be called hyperextension. But some sources will just call this extension. The reason why I think it's important to use a hyperextension there is because when we're talking about the elbow, for instance, we have flexion and extension, and that's all it can do. But if we could hyperextend the elbow, which we can't, and I'm certain I can demonstrate it, we bend the elbow back to the other direction. Now, arms and legs are good examples for this. Oh, I should say about the leg, the knee's backwards. When you flex the knee, it's actually moving posteriorly. When you extend the knee, it's moving anteriorly. And that's just because your knee is backwards. Imagine what your chair would look like if your knee bent the same direction as your elbow. But otherwise, everything, flexion is anterior and extension is posterior. And we can use hyperextension to mean moving past the anatomical position plane. They also show here in the picture flexion and extension at the neck, so moving the head forward or backwards. And the same thing could be demonstrated for the spine. You can flex and extend your whole body forward or backwards, anterior or posterior. Okay. So those are flexion and extension. The next pair to, and let me add in there, hyperextension. Again, some sources will not include that, but really it should mean moving past anatomical position in a more posterior position. The next pair is abduction and adduction. Okay. Now these two words only have one letter in different, which is the second letter is either a B or a D. Okay. This is moving in the medial lateral direction. Okay. When you move something laterally, that's abduction. Okay, so if I'm going to move my shoulder joints so that my arms go out laterally, that's abduction. And if I'm going to move back into anatomical position, that's adduction. The common way to remember that is that abduction is away from the body. Didn't do that right. So away from the body for abduction. Okay. And then, of course, adduction would be the other direction, but it doesn't fit the words perfect. Okay. There is not a third term for that. We don't have a hyperadduction or something like that, like with hyperextension. But there are those two. And back to the pictures here. They kind of show that with the arms, abduction, adduction. You can do the same thing with the legs. If your legs go off, doing the splits or something like that, that's abduction, adduction. And then the next term, which isn't pairwise because there's not two versions of this movement, is rotation, which we've kind of already talked about. Now, there is technically a two-term version of this. Sometimes you'll hear reference to lateral rotation versus medial rotation, okay? But not always. That only applies to rotation in joints that are off midline, okay? So going back to our pivot joint where we saw rotation at the neck, we don't talk about medial or lateral there because everything's on midline, so we're not medially rotating versus laterally rotating. Everything's just rotation. But if you're rotating something that is off of midline, then you can talk about medial and lateral. So in the picture there, they're showing the leg. I'm going to demonstrate with my arm. Again, it's easiest to see rotation of the arm if I bend my elbow, flex my elbow. In the picture, they're showing how the foot rotates, which is essentially the same idea. So I can medially rotate my arm, which is going to move the forearm medially across my body, or I can laterally rotate that. Now you can't see it because my feet are not in your line of view, but I can laterally rotate with the foot sticking off to the side, or I can medially rotate so my foot's back in the center. If I'm going to bend my knee to do that, okay, medial rotation is actually bringing my knee medially, and so my foot's kind of sticking out to the side here. And laterally rotating my leg with my knee flexed looks the opposite. Again, that's because the knee bends the wrong direction. I shouldn't say the wrong direction, but the opposite direction of the elbow. So sometimes we can use medial and lateral when we're talking about rotation. Now, rotation is different than a different term which we call circumduction. Okay. Now, the word circumduct means almost literally to carry through a circle. And the example here in the book, which is not a very good drawing for this, shows the arm not rotating, but rather drawing a circle. Okay, that's circumduction. What it really is a combination of flexion and extension and abduction and adduction. Okay. So if I demonstrate moving my arm in this way while drawing on the board, if I don't know how well you're going to see this, but if I flex and extend my arm, I'm moving it back and forth like this, anterior to posterior. If I abduct and adduct my arm, then I'm going to get that kind of movement. If I do those both at the same time, I draw a circle, which is circumduction. So that's really all circumduction is. It's a combination of flexion, extension, and abduction, adduction. If I do it with the metacarpal phalangeal joint, okay, I can flex and extend that joint like this. I can abduct and adduct the joint like this. If I do them together, I'm going whoop-de-doo. Okay, that's circumduction of the finger there. There are some special examples of these kind of movements that are, there are some special cases of movement that I want to show with this second set. The first one is pronation and supination. And this only applies to the forearm. And this is what I was describing a little bit ago when I was showing that pivot joint at the radial ulna, proximal end. Pronation and supination is just changing the position of your hand relative to anatomical position. So in anatomical position, I'm standing here in front of you and my palms are facing forward. If I rotate my palms like this, I'm pronating my forearm. Okay? I don't have to do it in anatomical position. This is pronated, this is supinated. Okay? Really what's happening, and the model I was showing you earlier really demonstrates this. In anatomical position, the radius and ulna are parallel. When you pronate your forearm, the radius has to cross over the ulna. So proximally at the elbow joint end, the radius is lateral and the ulna is medial. But then distally at the wrist end, the radius is medial and the ulna is lateral when you're in the pronated position. Supinated, they're parallel. The radius is always lateral in anatomical position. And then when you pronate, the two cross over. That's very hard to actually demonstrate doing that with my forearm, but the model is really good for that. So these two words come from the words prone and supine, which are two ways to describe somebody laying down. When somebody's prone, they're laying down on their stomachs. When they're supine, they're laying down on their backs. So really, pronation and supination is referring to the position of the palms in those positions. So if we're laying down in an anatomical position on our backs, our palms are up. That's supine, supination. If we're laying down on our stomachs when we're prone, our palms are down. That's pronation. I had a student several years ago who, I don't know, took A&P in high school or something like that, or from another one of the professors here, I don't know. But she said she had been told before a good way to remember that is if you can hold soup, you're in a supine position or supinated position. If you can't, then you're pronated. So that helps. Kind of think of your hands as a soup bowl. That's supinated. And that only applies to the forearm. Now, I say that because if you go to buy shoes, and let's say you're a runner or something like that, and you're trying to put a lot of money into some really good running shoes, the person trying to sell you shoes will ask you whether you pronate or supinate your foot. Okay. This doesn't really apply to the foot. What they're talking about is if you're running, do you run more on the outside edge or the inside edge of your foot? Okay. I had the opportunity to meet with a podiatrist for other reasons. And while I was there, and I said, I just got to ask you this question. I'm an anatomy teacher and it's driving me crazy. Why would anybody use pronate and supinate for the foot? And she just said, oh, that's what we call it. And I said, but it's not anatomically correct. And I explained to her the prone and supine thing I just explained to you. And so she sat there for a bit and said, yeah, you're right. And what it is when they say prone or supine or pronated or supinated for the foot, they're really describing a combination of movements, which we're not going to get into all of them. But as far as we're concerned, pronation and supination is really just the movements of the forearm so that in the supine position or supinated position, your palms are up. In the pronated position, your palms are down. Supinated, the radius and ulna are parallel. Pronated, the radius and ulna are crossed over. That's what it's about. For the foot, it's actually a combination of movements that this podiatrist was telling me about. But it's partly these movements here that are highlighted in the picture. And the foot just has some special terms for it. Okay. First off, for the foot, we don't use flexion and extension exactly. Instead, there's plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. What this is describing is basically pointing your toes out like a dancer versus pointing your toes up towards the rest of your body. Okay. So I'm definitely not going to capture this on camera for those of you that aren't actually in the room, but let me demonstrate. So when you plantar flex, you're pointing your toes out. When you're dorsiflecting, you're pointing your toes up towards you. Okay. That's what it is. We don't say flexion and extension. They're both a type of flexion. The reason why they're both a type of flexion is because there's several joints involved in these movements, and there's flexion at some joint in both of them. Okay. So we're talking about this movement right here. Let me make this bigger, actually. Okay. When you plantar flex, the flexion is really that the angle at the arch of your foot is getting narrower. Okay. Just like when you flex your elbow, the angle of your elbow gets narrower, more acute. When you dorsiflect, it's this dorsal surface of the foot that is flexing or getting to be a smaller angle. There's several different joints involved here. Some of them are metatarsal joints. Some of them are metatarsal phalangeal joints. Some of them are, well, there's the ankle joint, which is the tibia fibula joint with the talus, one of the tarsal joints. So there's a number of different joints involved here. So exactly which one is flexing is different in the two different movements, but they have those two names. Okay. The other term for foot movements, pair terms, is inversion, and eversion. If anything, this is kind of what's usually meant by pronation and supination, especially for shoe salespeople. Okay. So inversion is when you curl your foot medially inward so that the outside edge of your foot is kind of what you'd be walking on. And eversion is the opposite, where you're sort of rolling your foot to the outside and you'd be stepping on the inside edge of your foot. Okay. So like I was saying, if you're buying expensive running shoes, when they're talking about pronation and supination, that's really what they're talking about. Do you run on this side or on this side of your foot? And the reason that's important for buying shoes is because different brands of shoes are going to have more support on one side or the other of the sole. Okay. If you buy the wrong kind of shoe and you put too much stress on the weak side of the sole, then you're going to chew up those shoes and you have to buy another pair sooner. So that's really what the shoe buying experience is about. But really from the podiatrist's point of view, the word pronation and supination is really describing a combination of several different movements at once, which we're not going to get into. Then the next set, or next few sets of words are always demonstrated in terms of the jaw, okay? But they're actually not limited to just what happens at the jaw. So the first pair is elevation and depression. Elevation means to go up and depression means to go down. So if you elevate your mandible, you're closing your jaw. If you depress your mandible, you're opening your jaw. Okay, which is in the picture here. Okay. Elevation and depression of the mandible, opening and closing your teeth or your jaw. The other pair of words is protraction and retraction, which is moving forward, sticking something out forward anteriorly, or pulling something back posteriorly. And for the jaw, we're talking about sticking your jaw out for an underbite is protraction, and pulling your jaw back for an overbite is retraction. Okay. That's what they're getting at there. Now, those terms don't have to just apply to the jaw. They're just the easiest demonstration of it. Another place where we see the same sort of things is in with the shoulder blades. You can elevate your shoulder blades, which is shrugging. You can depress your shoulder blades, which is lowering them. You can protract your shoulders. You can retract your shoulders. So all of those apply there. It's very easy. It's kind of fun to do the override thing when I'm talking about it. So, now, there should be another pair of words here, and I've never actually, spent the time to try to figure out what they are. But for the jaw, you can move your jaw side to side, okay, which might be one of these other words that we've talked about, but I can't imagine what it would be. Maybe you would be abducting your jaw, okay, but doesn't quite fit there. Whenever I do that, it reminds me of this old Far Side cartoon. I don't know if anybody even remembers Far Side anymore, but there's this cartoon of a cockroach eating breakfast, and it's eating, its jaw is going back and forth, and each time it moves its jaw to one side, some of the food goes out that side, and then the food goes out that side. So I don't know why I remember that, but this cockroach couldn't eat breakfast. Not that cockroaches actually have mandibles like ours or anything like that, but it was losing all its food because of the way it was moving its jaw. It was funny. The last movement term is opposition, which is specifically what happens at the saddle joint. Okay, opposable thumbs, when we oppose our thumb, go through opposition, we're bringing our thumb across to meet with our other fingers. Okay, there actually is another term in there, which I thought the book actually included in that picture, but it might be somewhere in the text, that has to do with the other movement that's with opposition. So you oppose your thumb by moving it towards the other fingers, and then the opposite movement has a different term. I don't remember what that is offhand. But again, those are the movement terms. All of them there on the board together if you need that. But the pictures there in the book kind of go through them to some extent. And those of you that actually came to class today got to see me actually demonstrate them. One other aspect of movement that I want to introduce is actually something that's here. It's abduction and adduction. It means something special when we're talking about the eyes. Okay? So if you're going to abduct your eye, you're going to look off to the side. And if you're going to adduct your eye, you're going to look across midline. The eye isn't moving away from the body or towards the body, rather that your line of gaze is changing. Now, when I demonstrated that, why did I cover the other eye? Yeah, because they're on either sides of midline, so when one eye abducts, the other eye is adducting. Okay? You can't make both eyes abduct at the same time. You can, however, make both eyes adduct at the same time. If you're looking at something as it gets closer and closer to your face, your eyes have to converge on that thing so that they're both looking at the same thing. So when your eyes are getting kind of cross-eyed, that's when they're both adduct. But you can't make both eyes abduct at the same time. I remember when I was in college, we used to play this game with drunk people where they're really drunk and you're doing this in front of them, your hands going by their face. And then all of a sudden you go, okay, everything's going off the side, and everything's going off, and their eyes are following your hands around. And then all of a sudden you go, like that. And then their eyes for a second just try to abduct at the same time. And they go, oh, and it's lots of fun, and they throw up or something like that. So you're in college, go find a drunk person and do that too. Anyways, so those are movement terms. Any questions about those? Okay. Again, this is kind of a bridge chapter, getting from the skeleton, and we're going into the muscles. Next time when we start back after spring break, we're going to be looking at the muscles, and we're going to consider how muscles produce movement. So these movement terms are going to be important. We're going to talk about which muscle causes flexion of the elbow, which muscle causes extension of the elbow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to come back to this quite a bit. It's an important part of setting all of this up. So I want to spend some time there. Now, like I said at the beginning, I didn't want to take a break because I expected this to only be a short class. So I went a little past when we would normally take a break, but we'll stop now. And we will take a break. Okay. I want you to be back here in, what, 2.5 weeks? Whatever that is, I can't even think of something. So be back here by 5:30 on March 25th, and we'll resume from this point on. Have a very nice long break. Oh, by the way, if you do have any questions that you need to send me while I'm at this conference or over spring break, I'll still be able to take questions. At the conference, I might not have great access to Wi-Fi because sometimes at conferences they charge you for Wi-Fi in the conference hall. But feel free to send me something, and when I get back to my hotel room, I'll be able to reply to questions.